On the morning of January 19th, 2004, desperate screams tore through the peaceful air of Nob Hill in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A 52-year-old woman who had moved into her new house less than 2 months after separating from her husband, just beginning a hopeful new chapter, was suddenly found lying in her own blood right at her front door. Police discovered a trail of blood stretching from the sidewalk into the living room, a blood-stained brick nearby, and a haunting mystery. Was the killer her suspicious ex-husband, or a stranger lurking in the city's shadows? Welcome to the Case Files, where we bring you real cases, stories of crime, justice, and the hidden truths behind every mysterious death. Today we're going back to 2005, to the city of Albuquerque in New Mexico, where a brutal murder shocked and shook the tight-knit, peaceful community of Nob Hill. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the infamous case of the murder of Katherine Hauser, the mystery of the woman in the new house at Nob Hill, a case that forced an entire neighborhood to ask, are women who live alone ever truly safe, even in the quietest, safest-seeming communities? Part 1. Setting and Characters. Nob Hill, where peace turned into a nightmare. Albuquerque is the largest city in New Mexico, famous for its colorful hot air balloon festivals and distinctive adobe architecture deeply rooted in the culture of the American Southwest. But nestled inside this busy city, the Nob Hill neighborhood has its own unique charm, a place where time seems to slow down, where everyone recognizes each other's faces and trades greetings each morning. Nob Hill is an old residential area stretched along the legendary Route 66, the cross-country highway that once symbolized the American dream. Here, homes in Pueblo Revival and Spanish colonial styles sit close together beside vintage shops, cozy coffee houses, and old bookstores filled with the smell of aged paper. It's a neighborhood where people go to church together, host block meetings, and live close-knit, community-centered lives. That's why, when a murder happened right in the middle of Nob Hill, the entire community was stunned. This wasn't a ghetto or a crime-ridden zone. This was where middle-class families built their homes, where kids played on the street without fear. But on that fateful morning, everything changed forever. Katherine Hauser, a successful woman hungry for freedom. Katherine R. Hauser, often called Katherine, pronounced Katrin, was a 52-year-old woman full of energy and determination. She worked as a manager at Intel Corporation, one of the largest semiconductor companies in the world, with tens of thousands of employees globally. Her job demanded absolute precision, sharp logical thinking, and strong leadership, qualities Katherine had in abundance after years in a high-pressure tech environment. Her colleague, Augusta Meir, who had worked with Katherine for many years, recalled in an emotional voice, "Katherine was an outstanding manager, a smart and very capable woman. She knew how to inspire her team. She was always fair in her decisions, and she never left anyone behind. People respected her, not just for her position, but for who she was as a person." But behind the image of a successful woman was a marriage slowly falling apart, beyond saving. Katherine had married Hubert Hauer, often called Hugh, a man she once loved and trusted deeply. They built a life together, shared joyful and painful moments, but over time, their relationship began to crack under disagreements that could no longer be fixed. Around Thanksgiving 2004, late November, Katherine made the hardest decision of her life, to separate from Hubert and begin formal divorce proceedings. It wasn't an easy decision, especially for someone like Katherine, a devout Catholic who went to church regularly and believed deeply in the sacred nature of marriage. But Katherine knew what she wanted and what she deserved. She no longer wanted to live in a marriage lacking love and happiness. She knew she deserved more than that, and she was strong enough to start over. The new house, a symbol of freedom. After the separation, Katherine moved into a house at 3401 Campus Boulevard NE, right in the heart of Nob Hill, a place where she could start a new chapter in her life. The house wasn't very big, but it was bright and airy, with a small front yard, large windows that let in the morning sunlight, and a private space where she could live her own way, without explaining or asking permission from anyone. For Katherine, this house was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of freedom, of her right to choose her own life, a hopeful fresh start after years of struggle in her marriage. Her bright red convertible was usually parked right in front of the house, a vivid splash of color in a quiet neighborhood of cream and brown homes. Neighbor Steve Fine, who lived nearby, recalled his first impression of Katherine. When she moved in, the whole street noticed because she really stood out. She was a beautiful, confident woman and very friendly to the people around her. We didn't talk much, just said hello when we passed each other, but I was really impressed by her style and her confidence. Katherine was not just a good neighbor, she was also a deeply kind-hearted woman who constantly thought of others. She actively joined local charity work, especially at homeless shelters near Nob Hill. On weekends, she often volunteered to cook meals, serve hot food, and hand out clothing to people less fortunate, those forced to sleep on the cold streets of Albuquerque. Katherine had a heart of gold, another volunteer said with a choked voice. She always smiled at everyone, never judged, never looked at anyone with contempt. She treated the homeless like regular human beings who deserved respect, not like society's throwaways. And it was that kindness, that belief in the goodness in people, that would later become the most tragic element of her life story. Part 2. Signs of trouble and a complex relationship. Hubert Hauer, the mysterious ex-husband. Hubert Hauer, or Hugh as everyone called him, worked at a local church near Nob Hill, just a few blocks from Katherine's house. His job involved maintenance and supporting church activities, a position that seemed peaceful and meaningful on the surface. But the relationship between Hugh and Katherine in the months leading up to her death was anything but simple or friendly. After their separation in November 2004, they still had to interact to settle financial matters, shared assets, and finalize the divorce, exchanges that often carried heavy tension and intense, hard-to-control emotions. Katherine had planned to meet Hugh in early January 2005 to pick up the last of her personal belongings, the final items linking them together. These are usually the most emotionally charged meetings in any divorce, where both people must face each other and the memories of a marriage that has fallen apart beyond repair. Those who knew both of them said Hugh never fully accepted the divorce and showed signs of clinging to the relationship, even as Katherine firmly moved forward. But was that enough to turn Hugh into a murderer? Or was there a completely different story behind this case, involving a stranger silently watching from the shadows? The final days. In the first days of January 2005, Katherine seemed to be living a normal life, going to work at Intel, joining charity activities, and slowly getting used to living alone in her new home. She seemed happier, more at ease, and was finally starting to find herself again after years of emotional loss in her marriage. But on the morning of January 19, 2000, everything changed forever. Part 2. The fateful morning. Screams that shattered the dawn. January 19, 2005 was a routine Wednesday in Albuquerque. The sun rose early, the sky was clear with thin white clouds, and the temperature hovered around 59 degrees Fahrenheit, a fairly cold but crisp winter morning, perfect for a new workday. At around 6:30 a.m., when most people were just waking up and getting ready for the day, Stephen, a neighbor living directly across the street from Katherine, stepped outside to wheel his trash can to the curb. It was his weekly habit, since the garbage truck came early in the morning, a simple, ordinary task in everyday life. But as he was doing that, Stephen suddenly heard a scream from somewhere in the neighborhood. It wasn't laughter or kids yelling, not playful noise. It was a scream filled with fear, pain, and desperation, the sound of someone in serious danger. Stephen stopped, listened, and felt something was wrong. The scream rang out again, short, frantic, then suddenly cut off as if silenced, mid-cry. He looked around the neighborhood, trying to locate where that disturbing sound came from. Everything seemed as normal as ever. Houses closed up, streets quiet, no obvious sign of trouble. Maybe it's just a couple arguing, Stephen thought to himself, trying to reassure his uneasy mind. Nob Hill had always been a safe, quiet place, rarely the scene of anything serious, so he decided not to act further and went back inside. But someone else, a passerby walking near Katherine's house at that exact moment, also heard the horrifying scream. At first, he too thought it might be nothing, maybe noise from a TV or radio, but the unease kept bothering him throughout the morning. When he got to work, that feeling of anxiety just wouldn't go away, and he finally decided to call the police to report an unusual scream coming from a house in Nob Hill around 6:30 a.m. that day. Police arrive on scene. Right after receiving the call, Albuquerque police dispatched officers to 34001 Campus Boulevard NE to check on the situation. Given how suspicious the report sounded and the concern that a serious crime might be underway, they also contacted Assistant District Attorney David, a seasoned prosecutor specializing in homicide cases, and told him to be ready for the worst-case scenario. When the officers arrived, they decided to observe the outside carefully before knocking or announcing themselves. They walked around to the back of the house, checked the back door and yard, and looked for anything unusual that might help them understand what was going on. Almost immediately, they found signs that made their hearts sink. Bright red blood on the sidewalk. Not a huge pool, just a few drops, but fresh and clearly visible, suggesting it hadn't been there long. A set of keys, lying on the ground near the front door, as if dropped in a struggle or while someone tried to escape. A blood-stained brick, a mid-sized brick heavy enough to kill, lying nearby with dried blood on its rough surface. The officers knew instantly that something very bad had happened here. They knocked on the front door several times, but got no response, no sounds from inside the silent house. Looking through the window, they saw a sight that made their own blood run cold. A woman's legs lying motionless on the floor, not moving, apparently surrounded by a dark pool of liquid. Realizing that a serious crime had occurred and that the victim might still be alive, the officers quickly used the keys they found outside to open the door and rushed into the house. The scene. A horrifying sight. The moment they stepped inside, the officers were confronted with a scene of blood, violence, and brutality that was almost beyond comprehension. A trail of blood stretched from the front door all the way into the living room, thick, dark red stains that suggested the victim was attacked outside, then dragged inside while badly injured. Katherine Hauser lay motionless on the living room floor, the same energetic 52-year-old woman her neighbors had greeted days earlier, now lying in her own blood, her face distorted by horrific injuries. Her jeans had been removed and her legs bound with that same pair of jeans, a clear and heartbreaking sign that she may have been sexually assaulted before or during the attack. Her head had suffered severe trauma. Katherine's face was covered in blood, and deep wounds on her head were still bleeding, forming a large pool on the floor beneath her. Even though the injuries were extremely severe, and the scene looked like she might already be dead, the officers realized Katherine was still barely alive. Her heart was still beating, slow but present, and she was still breathing, hanging on to the thinnest thread of life. They immediately called for an emergency ambulance and requested medics to come at once, and rush Katherine to the hospital in critical condition. While waiting, the officers tried to give basic aid and keep her stable, hoping she might survive and later tell them what had happened and who had done this to her. Meanwhile, other investigators stayed behind to secure the scene, document every detail through photographs, and start collecting crucial evidence before the killer could cover his tracks. Part 4. The Fight for Life and the First Clues. At the hospital, her final hours. Katherine Hauser was rushed into the emergency room in a deep coma, with head injuries so severe that the doctors rarely saw them in living patients. The medical team worked continuously, using every modern treatment available: emergency blood transfusions, mechanical ventilation, efforts to reduce brain swelling caused by massive trauma. But the injuries were just too extensive, and Katherine's brain had suffered irreversible damage from the vicious blows by the brick. Only a few hours after she arrived at the hospital, as her family and friends were still on their way, praying for a miracle, Katherine R. Hauser died from catastrophic brain injuries that doctors could not save her from. She never woke up to tell the police what happened in those terrifying final minutes, or to point out the person who took her life. Her death devastated her family, friends, colleagues, and the entire Nob Hill neighborhood. This was the first time such a savage murder had ever happened in their quiet area. The autopsy. Painful truths. Time wandereds. The autopsy was carried out quickly, with top forensic experts involved, and their findings painted a chilling picture of what Katherine endured in her last moments. Official cause of death: severe brain trauma caused by multiple blows with a hard, heavy object, identified as the blood-stained brick found at the scene. Number of blows: Katherine had been struck at least 5 times in the head with great force, breaking her skull, causing brain hemorrhaging and destroying brain tissue beyond repair. Signs of sexual assault: semen DNA was found on Katherine's chest, confirming she had been sexually assaulted during or shortly after the attack. DNA under her nails. DNA retrieved from under Katherine's fingernails showed she had fought back, scratching the attacker in a desperate attempt at self-defense, leaving vital biological trace evidence. Attack sequence. Based on the blood trail, key location, and brick, forensic experts concluded Katherine had been attacked as soon as she stepped outside, or as she was opening the door early that morning, likely to take out the trash or grab the paper. The attacker lay in wait, struck her from behind or the side with the brick, causing her to scream and fall, then dragged her into the house where he raped her and kept beating her until she died. Missing items: Katherine's purse and cell phone were missing from the scene, suggesting the crime involved opportunistic theft combined with sexual violence. The first suspect, Hubert Hauer. Investigators knew the golden rule in homicide cases involving women. In over 60% of cases, the killer is the husband, boyfriend, or ex-partner. So they quickly turned to Hubert Hauer, the estranged husband in the middle of a divorce. At the time of the murder, Katherine and Hugh were in the final stages of a tense divorce process. She had planned to meet Hugh in early January to pick up the last of her personal belongings, moves that often stir up intense emotions and can trigger explosive confrontations. Detectives visited the church where Hugh worked, just a few blocks from Katherine's home, close enough for him to easily show up at her house. When he was told about his ex-wife's brutal death, his reaction worried the seasoned officers. Instead of breaking down, reacting in shock, or crying as many people do when hearing of a loved one's death, Hugh seemed unusually calm, almost emotionless. He answered questions in a mechanical way, showing little visible feeling, as though he were talking about a stranger, not the woman he had lived with and once loved. But the most troubling detail, the one that really alarmed investigators, was that Hugh mentioned Katherine had been raped, even though police had not disclosed that information to anyone outside the investigative team and forensic staff. "How do you know Katherine was raped?" one investigator asked, sharply. Hugh said he had overheard other officers casually talking about it in the church hallway when they came to find him. A vague, hard-to-verify explanation that didn't sound convincing. Hugh's statement. Hugh claimed that on the morning of January 19, 2000, he was having breakfast with his mother in northwest Albuquerque, an area quite far from the crime scene, about a 20 to 30-minute drive away. He insisted he couldn't have been at Katherine's house around 6:30 a.m. when the attack happened. His mother backed up his story, saying her son had arrived early, and they had breakfast together as usual. But investigators knew family members often protect each other, especially mothers and sons, so her support alone wasn't enough to clear him. When police talked to Hugh's co-workers at the church about his behavior that day, they said he came in looking more worried and unsettled than usual. He told a few people he was having some personal problems, but didn't want to go into details and asked to be left alone. Investigators took Hugh's DNA and started reviewing his phone records to pinpoint his location at the time of the crime. They also seized his shoes and clothing to compare them with the evidence from the scene. Everything seemed to point toward Hugh, a clear motive, odd behavior, and knowledge of details that hadn't been released. But then science spoke up, and the story shifted completely. Part 5. DNA Evidence and an Uncomfortable Truth. The DNA results, a big surprise. After several tense days of waiting, the lab returned the DNA results, delivering a shock that flipped the entire direction of the investigation. Hubert Hauer's DNA did not match the semen found on Katherine's body or the DNA under her fingernails. That meant Hugh was not the one who sexually assaulted and attacked her, at least not with his own hands. The shoe prints at the scene didn't match any shoes Hugh owned. None of Katherine's blood was found on his clothing or personal items. Cell tower data showed Hugh's phone was pinging near his mother's house around the time of the murder, supporting both of their statements. That raised a huge question. If it wasn't Hugh, then who was it? And why was his behavior so strange? It was possible that Hugh was simply a shocked man, processing grief in an unusual way. His knowledge of the rape might indeed have come from overhearing careless comments by officers talking where they shouldn't have. Another darker theory briefly surfaced. Could Hugh have hired someone to kill Katherine? But that idea quickly collapsed when no financial irregularities were found, no suspicious calls, no messages linking him to any potential hitman. In the end, investigators had to accept a hard truth. Hugh Hauer was not involved in the murder, and they were back at square one with a faceless killer still free. Shifting the investigation, searching the homeless community. When they re-examined the scene more carefully, investigators began focusing on a different theory. This might have been a crime of opportunity carried out by a transient, not a planned murder by someone close to the victim. Several details supported this theory. Time of the attack. Katherine was assaulted around 6:30 a.m., the time she could have been stepping out to take out the trash or pick up the paper, a daily routine anyone watching her house could notice. It's also when many homeless people are still wandering the streets after a night sleeping outside. Missing person phone. Classic signs of opportunistic theft. The attacker grabbed whatever valuable items were easy to grab and use or sell quickly. Nob Hill's location. Though a nice, quiet neighborhood, Nob Hill is close to charity centers and shelters for the homeless, the very places where Katherine volunteered weekly. That meant a lot of homeless people lived in, passed through, or begged around the area. Unnecessary brutality. The fact that Katherine was struck at least 5 times suggested this wasn't a cool, calculated hit, but an impulsive, out-of-control assault, potentially by someone under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Police decided to widen their investigation into Albuquerque's homeless population. It was an incredibly tough, resource-heavy effort. In 2005, The city had around 3,000 homeless people living on the streets, a massive number to sift through one by one. Detectives visited shelters, encampments under bridges, parks, and alleys. They interviewed hundreds of people, collected DNA from those with violent or sexual crime histories, and patiently chased down every possible lead. Augusta Meir, Katherine's close colleague, could not accept that someone she helped with all her heart might have turned on her. Katherine was truly kind to them, Augusta said with tears in her voice. She cooked for them, brought warm clothes in winter, and never looked at them with judgment. How could anyone repay her like this? But investigators had worked long enough to know that crime doesn't care about kindness. Sometimes it's the most generous people who become the easiest targets. The shoe prints, a crucial clue. While the broader investigation was unfolding, crime scene experts kept analyzing every tiny detail at the house and uncovered a crucial clue that had almost been overlooked. Bloody shoe prints. Not just one or two, but dozens of clearly visible prints, from the sidewalk where Katherine was first attacked, through the doorway, and into the living room where she collapsed in her own blood. The prints showed clear tread patterns, specific size, and unique wear marks, like a fingerprint for that particular pair of shoes. Forensic specialists photographed, measured, and studied them carefully. They determined it was a common type of athletic shoe sold widely, but what made this pair special was how the tread had worn down, with distinctive scuffs, missing rubber patches, and pressure patterns that suggested the wearer's gait and how long the shoes had been used. If we find these shoes, we'll find the killer, the lead investigator said firmly. This pattern is one of a kind. There's no confusing it with any other pair. Part 6. Philip James. Busey, hiding in the shadows. A tip from the shelter. After weeks of exhausting work and interviews with hundreds of homeless people across Albuquerque, police received a key tip from a shelter worker. Philip James Busey, 42 years old, a homeless man with a criminal history, stretching back more than 2 decades. His record was disturbing. He had spent 22 of the last 23 years behind bars, mainly for property crimes and drug offenses to support his addiction. While he didn't have a long history of violent sexual crimes, his thick rap sheet still showed a man who lived outside the law, ignored social rules, and was willing to break them to get what he wanted. One detail especially grabbed investigators' attention. At the time of Katherine's murder on January 19, 2005, Busey had been living on the streets in and around Nob Hill, just a few blocks from her house, well within range to observe her home and daily habits. When detectives tracked Busey down for questioning, nearly a month after the murder, he was staying at another shelter on the south side of the city. He appeared cooperative and strangely calm, showing none of the nervousness or panic commonly seen in innocent people being questioned in a murder case. He claimed that on the morning of January 19th, he was sleeping in a nearby park after a cold night outside and had no idea about the murder the police were investigating. He insisted he didn't know Katherine Hauser and had never met her. But then there was one small detail that made every investigator perk up. Busey was wearing an old, worn-out pair of sneakers, the same type they had been looking for, based on the shoe prints at the scene. The shoes of fate. "Do you mind if we take a look at your shoes?" one officer asked calmly, trying not to betray his tension. Busey hesitated, a flicker of worry passing through his eyes, but finally agreed, handing the shoes over reluctantly. He probably believed that after a month, any incriminating trace would be long gone. When the forensic expert compared Busey's soles to the photographed prints from the crime scene, the result made the entire team hold its breath. The patterns matched 100%. Every groove, every worn patch, every scratch lined up perfectly like two halves of the same image. Then, under a microscope and special lighting, they found traces of dried, oxidized blood still stuck deep inside the small grooves. Blood Busey had tried to wipe away, but couldn't fully remove from the deep rubber channels. "We've got him," one investigator whispered. "Now, we just need the DNA." The decisive DNA evidence. Police collected a DNA sample from inside Busey's mouth and rushed it to the lab, along with the blood found on his shoe soles. After another agonizing wait, the results came back with undeniable answers. Busey's DNA matched 100% with the semen found on Katherine's chest, even though it was a very small sample, about 6 sperm cells, roughly 1/127 of a droplet. It was enough to identify him as the source. His DNA also matched the DNA under Katherine's fingernails, proving she had scratched him while fighting for her life in those last, desperate moments. The blood on his shoe soles was confirmed to be Katherine Hauser's, proof that he had stepped in her blood at the crime scene. When they examined the clothes Busey was wearing at the time of his arrest, almost a month after the murder, they found a small blood stain on his pants, which also turned out to be Katherine's blood. These were critical, ironclad pieces of evidence. Science had spoken, clearly identifying Philip James Busey as the man who raped and killed Katherine Hauser on that fateful morning of January 19th, 2005. Arrest and Busey's story. Philip James Busey was formally arrested on serious charges: first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and theft. When confronted with the overwhelming DNA and shoe print evidence, Busey at first continued to deny everything. He insisted he didn't know Katherine and had never been at her house. But as investigators laid out each piece of evidence in detail, matching DNA, blood on his shoes and pants, and the perfect shoe print match, Busey realized there was no escape and reluctantly shifted his defense strategy. He admitted having had sexual contact with Katherine, but claimed it was consensual sex and that he had not killed her, saying someone else must have murdered her after he left. The story was so absurd it sparked anger and disbelief. A 52-year-old intel manager, living in a nice home, with a stable life, willingly having sex with a 42-year-old homeless man who hadn't bathed properly at 6:30 in the morning outside her front door, then somehow ending up bound with her own jeans and beaten to death with a brick right after he left? "You really think a jury is going to buy that?" one investigator asked with heavy sarcasm. Busey stayed silent, staring at the floor. He knew he had run out of road. All that was left was to wait for the court's judgment. Part 7. The Trial and Justice. The prosecution strategy. The case went to trial with an experienced prosecution team determined to put Busey away for good. The trial drew major attention from Albuquerque residents and the media, as it was the most shocking murder Nob Hill had seen in years. The prosecution strategy rested on 3 solid pillars: physical evidence at the scene. Busey's shoe prints perfectly matched those at the house, from the sidewalk all the way into the living room. Katherine's blood on his shoe soles and pants proved he was there and in direct contact with her as she bled. Unshakable DNA evidence. Busey's DNA matched the semen found on Katherine and the DNA under her fingernails, proving he had sexually assaulted her and physically struggled with her. Forensic testimony about cause of death. Katherine's head injuries matched the brick from the scene, and the medical examiner testified she died from blunt force trauma caused by being struck at least 5 times with a heavy object. The prosecutor laid out a detailed, logical narrative of the crime, built around the evidence. On the morning of January 19th, 2005, around 6:30 a.m., Philip Busey was wandering through Nob Hill after a cold night outside. He saw Katherine Hauser, a woman living alone, stepping out of her house, maybe to take out the trash or pick up the morning paper. He saw an opportunity to steal and to satisfy his vile desires. He approached her and struck her with a brick from behind or from the side. causing her to scream in pain. He dragged her into the house, raped her while she was dying, and continued beating her with the brick until she stopped moving. Then he stole her purse and phone and fled, leaving her to die in a pool of her own blood. The forensic doctors took the stand and described Katherine's injuries with heartbreaking clarity. The victim suffered severe head trauma from at least 5 separate blows. Her skull was fractured, her brain was bleeding, and the damage was irreparable. This was one of the most brutal attacks I have seen in my entire career. Katherine's friends and colleagues, including Augusta Meir, testified about her kind nature and her compassion, moving many in the courtroom to tears. Katherine would never hurt anyone, Augusta said through tears. She just wanted to help people. Even the homeless society had turned its back on. And this is how she was repaid. The defense and its failure. Busey's defense attorney, Lee Hood, tried to plant seeds of doubt by pointing back at Hubert Hauer, the ex-husband. He argued that Hubert had a strong motive: a failed marriage, jealousy over his wife starting a new life, and divorce proceedings that would formally separate them. He highlighted Hubert's odd behavior, showing up to work unusually anxious and knowing about the rape before it was publicly revealed. He suggested a theory that Hubert might have hired Busey or someone else to kill Katherine, and that Busey's DNA and presence at the scene were simply because he was the hired hand. But the prosecution struck back forcefully and logically. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense is trying to distract you with baseless speculation. Hubert Hauer's DNA is not at the scene. Philip Busey's DNA is, on the victim's body, under her fingernails. Hubert's shoes don't match the prints. Busey's do, perfectly. Katherine's blood is not on Hubert's clothes. It is on Busey's shoes and pants. There is no evidence of any payment, no suspicious contact, no trace of any arrangement between Hubert and Busey. This is not about vague theories or hunches. This is about hard science, and the science points to one man: Philip James Busey. The verdict and sentence. After many tense days of testimony from witnesses and experts and the presentation of all the evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. Only a few hours later, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and theft. Philip James Busey was sentenced to a total of 66 years in prison, with at least 30 years to be served before he would even be eligible for parole, followed by additional time for other serious offenses. At age 42 when sentenced, he would have to remain behind bars until at least 72, and in reality, the length of his sentence meant he would almost certainly die in prison. As the verdict was read aloud, Katherine's family and friends embraced and wept. It wasn't the relief of joy, but the raw sorrow of a wound that would never fully heal. Katherine was gone, the new life she had hoped for, stolen forever. But at least justice had been served, and the man who took her life would pay with the rest of his own. Busey showed no remorse or visible emotion as he heard his fate. He turned away, coldly accepting the future he had brought upon himself. The legacy of Katherine Hauser. Katherine Hauser died at 52, far too young, at a time when life still held countless experiences and unfulfilled dreams. She never got to truly enjoy the new life of freedom she had so bravely chosen, never saw the happier days that might have been waiting ahead. She deserved more, much more than what she got. Yet in her tragedy, Katherine left behind a powerful lesson for all of us, about trust, about the danger that can lurk even in the safest-looking neighborhoods, and about the need to stay alert, even when doing good from the purest place in your heart. Her colleagues and friends carried on the charitable work she had poured herself into, helping the homeless and victims of domestic violence, but with stronger safety measures. That's how we honor Katherine Augusta said. She believed in the goodness of people, and we will keep believing in that too, but with wisdom and caution. A safety message. Katherine Hauser's case reminds us that danger doesn't only come at night or from obviously shady strangers. Sometimes it comes in broad daylight on a bright morning, right at your front door, from someone you might once have tried to help. Always be aware of your surroundings. Install security systems if you can, and never open your door or step outside without looking carefully first. Kindness is a beautiful thing, but you must protect yourself before you can protect others. Katherine Hauser deserves to be remembered, not for the horror of her death, but for the goodness of her life. A successful, independent, compassionate woman who always thought of others. Rest in peace, Katherine Hauser. Your kindness will never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share to support our work. See you in the next episode of The Case Files. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, even in the brightest morning, darkness can be waiting just outside your door,